All right, so I recently received another advice request from a young woman on Twitter named Emma, and this is an interesting question here. The question is, I'll paraphrase, but she pretty much says she's 22 years old and she really is sexually attracted to the prospect of a man beating her up, pretty much is what she says. And she's worried about this. She's asking, is this normal? And pretty much, what should she do? And this is a tricky one, but I have a few things I would say. The first is that it all depends how intensely you want this, right? How significant and pressing a psychological compulsion is this wish or fantasy? This is the $1 million question, because if it's just a kind of passing, fleeting sort of urge or wish that kind of pops into your mind here and there, that's one thing. But if it's a kind of deep-seated urge and need that's really constantly gnawing at you, then that's something different. And so to answer the initial part of the question, is this common or is this normal? I would say that a basic kind of attraction to power and dominance is certainly normal. I mean, there are good evolved reasons why a woman is sexually attracted to generally powerful men who can potentially inflict violence, right? It's adaptive to be sexually attracted to powerful men who can inflict violence, for the obvious reason that if that's who you're partnered up with, they can inflict that violence on other people, right? So it makes sense that humans would evolve, or women would evolve, a kind of sexual predilection for a potentially violent man, possibly even a concretely violent man. It makes sense that that would emerge over the long run of human history, because it's beneficial to have sex with this type of man, right? That's going to be selected for over time. So on some base level, if it's just a basic kind of attractiveness to power and dominance, that's quite normal. Now, what they call paraphilias, which are essentially, fetishes or distinct, more or less stable kinks, where one is has a particular unique sexual kind of reliance on a particular formation of some kind. This is relatively rare, but it's obviously increasingly accepted in today's culture. It's easy to find different sexual subcultures, different kink communities. It's still relatively rare. Something like 2% of men are reported to have actual kind of practices in masochism, or I think it's something like 1% in women. So it is less common among women. Masochism is less common among women as a distinct, legit kind of sexual fetish or paraphilia. But I do believe actually that I read, of all of the different paraphilias, masochism is one of the most popular among women. So men in general have more paraphilias than women. But when you look at the paraphilias that women do have, masochism is on the higher end, I do believe, in terms of popularity for women. So these are very low percentages, all in all, right? 2%, 1%, a very small minority of people have legitimate kind of sexual kinks or fetishes or paraphilias. Now, there is still more that one could say about this, which is that there is a kind of disorder of sexual masochism. You can have this type of obsession to a degree that becomes destructive in your life in different ways, right? So I won't go into it too much, because I doubt that this describes you, but it can become an obsession. It can become a kind of addiction, and there are certain kind of morbid characteristics that can be associated with an intense kind of masochistic drive or need or desire or whatever you want to call it. So this is why this is the big variable, is kind of how intense is this urge or fantasy you have to be beaten up. I would say if it's on the lighter end, it's probably most likely one of the many fairly normal kind of passing notions that many young people or people throughout their lives periodically get. I mean, I can tell you, I won't tell you in detail, maybe another time, but when I was younger in my 20s, there was once or twice where I had kind of weird, surprising, but distinct kind of sexual ideas, let's just call it, or urges, let's say, a certain kind of fantasy formations that were pretty unique and specific and somewhat perverse. And frankly, it just went away pretty quickly. I mean, maybe for a couple months at a time or something like that. There was one or two times I remember something like that. So I would say, while paraphilias are relatively rare, many people in their life will once or twice have some type of strange, particular kind of sexual fixation. So if there's a good chance that, Emma, this is pretty much what you're dealing with, most likely, statistically, I would guess, without knowing anything else about you, I would guess this is a relatively passing, whatever type of experience or phase, if you will. And so that's one thing I would say. But it's possible, and perhaps you do have a real fetish or something like that. And if this doesn't go away, and if it's something that you really you can't shake it and it doesn't go away on its own, I guess I would say a couple things. One is I would say that, I mean, personally, I'm somewhat trad on this front. I'm somewhat kind of, Christian and traditionalist in that personally, I think our desires are just desires and they can very easily lead us astray. And so I don't think you should be ashamed of anything. But I do think that, sexual desires are relatively base appetites. And if you have a particular weird sexual desire, one straightforward solution, I know a lot of people won't like this, and some people will say this is oppressive or whatever, but I don't mean it in a judgmental way whatsoever. I do think a legitimate way of processing it is to control it pretty much through a superior kind of mental management of yourself. That is ultimately what humans are all about, right? We use reason and our mental cognitive capacities and our everyday discipline practices to keep our desires and appetites in line. This is what it means to be human in some sense. Certainly what it means to be a dignified human of good character, right? We constantly have to more or less suppress and manage and contain our fleeting appetites and desires, right? So I think that's a perfectly legitimate and in many ways admirable way to deal with kind of weird, awkward, difficult, or confusing sexual urges. I know this is not very popular or sexy or fashionable of an answer, but I do think that's a very tried and true and perfectly defensible, even honorable way of dealing with this sort of thing is you suppress it and you move forward with your life and you practice what you believe in and you work hard on, adapting. That's one solution. I'm not telling you necessarily have to want that type of kind of trad disciplined ethics. I would say, you could very well, if you chose to, another path would be you could explore this urge or fantasy that you have. There's nothing wrong with that. If you have a good partner who you trust in the privacy of your own relationship, I see no reason why you could not carefully experiment with this urge that you have or this drive that you have. I would not judge that. I'm certainly not discouraging you from that. I would consider doing that. Of course, the challenge there is finding a good, reliable, trustworthy partner who you can do that with safely. This is where it's really tricky. This is where it's dicey, because a major mistake, which I would really caution you against, would be seeking out violent or physically dominating men in order to satisfy this drive that you have or satisfy this curiosity or taste that you have. That's really dangerous, right? Because that's how you get yourself in these types of horror stories where you actually fall into an abusive relationship that's hard to get out of or something like that. So I would be very, very cautious about that. I would hate to see something like that happen to you. But if you could find a good man who you trust, who you're in a good relationship with, I see no reason why you couldn't experiment with some kind of role playing experiments in this direction. Just go slowly and be careful with it. And yeah, I think that does bring certain risks. There is always the risk of, perhaps falling into an abusive type of pattern, but you're an adult, and that's something that you'll have to, if you want to explore this, you'll just have to look out for that. I do think that's one of the reasons why I think simply, managing and containing, and some would even say suppressing these types of wild urges is in many ways a kind of better safe than sorry type of approach, frankly. I think it is very dangerous for women to get involved with actually physically dangerous men. So, but you're an adult, and if you have a good man you trust, then you could potentially experiment with this and see if it's something that you really want or need or whatever. I wouldn't tell you not to do that. Just be very careful. That's pretty much my 2 cents. Ultimately, I would just say my parting words would just be, don't treat this as some sort of big, bad, secret, terrible aspect of yourself. As I said before, I think a lot of people at many points in their lives, or at least at a few points in their lives, will have some sort of somewhat weird kind of sexual urge or fantasy. It's no big deal, it's what you do with it, right? And it's how you manage it or fail to manage it that matters. I would not treat this as like a deep, dark secret that you're constantly kind of reflecting on and feeling guilty for. No, not at all. I would say that another thing, it's sort of obvious, which is why I didn't say it, but if it really is gnawing at you over time and it becomes, really gives you a lot of anxiety, one obvious thing to do would be to talk to a therapist about it, just because it's good to talk to therapists about anything, really. That's not to pathologize it, because frankly, I don't think anything you're describing so far, just from the information I have, I don't think any of it sounds necessarily like a pathology. Like I said, I think it's fairly normal for people to get kind of random notions such as this in their mind and have a kind of vague kind of sexual attraction towards different weird things. So I don't think it's necessarily pathological. I think it's unlikely to be pathological. I would just accept it, see if it goes away. If not, consider talking to a therapist. If it continues to gnaw at you, either develop practices to manage it and contain it and move forward in a kind of disciplined way, or find a good partner who you can trust, who you can experiment with these things on. There is always the possibility you could kind of explore the kink subcultures around this sort of thing, the sadomasochist communities. I don't have personal contact with them. I don't really know if that's something that I would advise or not. I'm not judging it positively or negatively. I don't know. I'm a little skeptical personally, but I know people who say good things about those communities. So that's something you have to figure out for yourself. I can't really speak in favor of it or against it. But you could certainly look into it possibly. But I would personally urge you to, go the path of having a good, strong relationship with someone, and in the comfort and safety of that, possibly experiment with these urges. Or you might just find that they all, go away, because I think these types of urges or fantasies kind of come in and go out periodically in life. That's my read on it anyway. I hope that helps. I'm not exactly an expert on these topics, but I just gave you my personal, honest judgments. I hope they help. Obviously, as with all things, take everything I say with a grain of salt, and you have to kind of make your own judgments. Fact check the things I said. I don't know. I'm not in any position really to be particularly confident in this type of advice, but if for some reason people want my opinion on things, I'm happy to give it. So I hope that helped. All right.